Have you ever wondered why an avoidant ex can walk away from a relationship, seem completely fine, and then, weeks or even months later, suddenly reappear as if nothing happened? If they truly didn't care, why would they come back at all? And if they did care, why did they leave in the first place? The answer isn't as simple as love or loss. It lies much deeper inside the hidden psychological patterns that shape how avoidantly attached people experience closeness, distance, and emotional pain. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the silence after a breakup is often far more meaningful than it appears, and why what looks like the end of the story may actually be the beginning of an invisible emotional journey. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant attachment is the belief that avoidants simply don't have deep feelings. Their calm behavior after a breakup often convinces people that they have already moved on. They seem active, social, productive, and sometimes even happier than before. While the other person is replaying every conversation and searching for answers, the avoidant appears untouched by the separation. That contrast can feel confusing and deeply painful. It creates the impression that the relationship mattered far more to one person than the other. But emotional distance is not the same as emotional indifference. An avoidance mind has learned something very different from an early age. Instead of moving toward emotional pain, it automatically moves away from it. When relationships become emotionally intense, their nervous system often interprets closeness as pressure instead of comfort. Even when they genuinely love someone, intimacy can quietly activate fear beneath the surface. That fear is rarely obvious. It doesn't always look dramatic. Instead, it often appears as emotional withdrawal, increased independence, less communication, or a growing desire for personal space. This is why many avoidant breakups feel so sudden. The relationship may have seemed normal just days before. There may have been no obvious argument, no major betrayal, and no clear warning. Yet inside the avoidance mind, emotional pressure has often been building for weeks or months. Every difficult conversation, every expectation, every vulnerable moment can slowly increase the feeling that they are losing their freedom. Eventually, leaving begins to feel like relief instead of loss. That relief is the first key stage after the breakup. It surprises many people because it doesn't resemble heartbreak at all. Instead of immediately grieving the relationship, many avoidants experience what psychologists often describe as deactivation. Their attachment system turns down emotional awareness to reduce internal discomfort. Rather than sitting with painful emotions, their mind redirects attention toward work, hobbies, travel, friends, fitness, or new goals. Their daily life becomes busy, and that busyness creates the illusion that they have completely healed. But this stage is important because it often gets misunderstood. The absence of visible emotion doesn't mean the absence of emotional attachment. It simply means the attachment system has temporarily shifted into self-protection. Imagine placing a heavy book on top of a spring. The spring hasn't disappeared. It's simply being held down. The emotional connection works in a similar way. The feelings are not necessarily gone. They are simply pushed beneath the surface where they become harder to recognize, even for the avoidant themselves. Dismissive avoidants often experience this stage by convincing themselves they are better off alone. Their inner dialogue may quietly repeat ideas like, "Relationships are too demanding," or "I'm happier focusing on myself." These thoughts reduce emotional conflict because they reinforce independence. Fearful avoidants, on the other hand, may experience something more confusing. They often crave closeness and fear it at the same time. Part of them misses the relationship almost immediately, while another part still feels overwhelmed by intimacy. This creates emotional confusion that can make their behavior seem inconsistent or unpredictable. During this early period, many people make the mistake of believing that if they can simply explain themselves one more time, the avoidant will suddenly understand everything. They send long messages, repeatedly ask for closure, or desperately try to remind their ex of the good memories they shared. While these actions usually come from love and fear of losing someone important, they often produce the opposite effect. An avoidant whose nervous system already feels overwhelmed tends to interpret repeated emotional contact as additional pressure. Instead of creating safety, it reinforces the very discomfort that caused emotional withdrawal in the first place. The more intense the pursuit becomes, the stronger the desire for distance often grows. This isn't because the avoidant enjoys causing pain. It's because emotional intensity activates the coping strategy they have relied on for years. This is where timing becomes far more important than intensity. Most people assume that stronger emotions create stronger results. In avoidant attachment, that assumption often fails. Emotional pressure can temporarily silence the very attachment system someone hopes to awaken. Space, however, creates something different. Space removes immediate pressure. It allows the nervous system to settle. It gives suppressed thoughts room to quietly return without feeling forced. That doesn't mean every avoidant comes back. It doesn't mean every breakup has a hidden reunion waiting at the end. Human behavior is far too complex for simple guarantees. Personality, emotional maturity, relationship quality, life circumstances, and individual attachment patterns all shape what happens next. But one psychological truth appears again and again. The emotional timeline of an avoidant rarely matches what other people expect. What looks like freedom during the first days or weeks after a breakup is often only the surface of a much deeper process. The relief they feel is real, but relief is not the same as resolution. Emotional suppression can create temporary peace, but it cannot permanently erase meaningful attachment. As life slowly becomes quieter, routines become familiar again, and the emotional intensity of the breakup fades, something unexpected often begins to happen. The silence that once felt comforting starts revealing emotions that were never fully processed in the first place. Why do so many avoidants begin thinking about an ex long after everyone else assumes they have moved on? Why do memories seem to appear out of nowhere, sometimes months after the breakup, when they looked perfectly happy without the relationship? The answer lies in something that often goes unnoticed. Emotional suppression is powerful, but it is never permanent. Eventually, the mind grows quieter, life settles into routine, and the feelings that were pushed aside begin searching for a way back into awareness. The first stage after a breakup often feels like freedom for an avoidant. There is less emotional pressure, fewer difficult conversations, and no expectations to meet. For a while, this feels like exactly what they needed. But human beings are remarkably adaptable. What first feels exciting eventually becomes ordinary. The new routine loses its novelty. The extra freedom no longer creates the same sense of relief. And as the emotional noise fades, something subtle begins to change. This is when the relationship slowly stops feeling like a source of pressure and starts becoming a memory. That shift matters more than most people realize. While the relationship was active, every disagreement, misunderstanding, or emotional conversation remained fresh in the avoidant's mind. Those experiences reinforced the belief that distance was the safest option. But once enough time passes, the brain naturally begins filtering memories differently. Negative emotions fade faster than many positive emotional memories. The difficult conversations become less vivid. The arguments lose their emotional intensity. Instead, the mind starts replaying quieter moments, a shared joke, a peaceful evening together, the way someone smiled across the room, a familiar voice, the comfort of predictable routines. These memories do not arrive because the avoidant consciously decides to think about them. They often appear automatically, triggered by ordinary moments throughout the day. A favorite restaurant, a certain song playing unexpectedly, a familiar perfume, driving past a place they once visited together. Even something as simple as making coffee alone on a quiet morning can unlock emotions that seemed completely gone. This surprises many avoidants because they genuinely believed they had already moved on. The subconscious mind works differently than conscious thought. It stores emotional associations beneath awareness, quietly connecting people, places, sounds, and experiences. When those associations are activated, they can create powerful emotional reactions without warning. An avoidant who believed they were emotionally detached may suddenly spend an entire evening thinking about someone they haven't spoken to in months. Dismissive avoidants often respond to these feelings by trying to rationalize them away. They tell themselves they are simply feeling nostalgic. They convince themselves everyone occasionally thinks about old relationships. They redirect attention back toward work or personal goals. Because independence remains central to their identity, admitting emotional longing can feel uncomfortable. It creates internal conflict between the desire for connection and the belief that needing someone represents weakness. Fearful avoidants experience this stage differently. Their emotional world is often more turbulent. They may miss their former partner intensely one day and convince themselves they should never reconnect the next. This creates exhausting emotional swings. They crave closeness while simultaneously fearing what closeness might require. Every emotional impulse is challenged by an equally powerful fear of vulnerability. One of the biggest reasons this stage becomes so emotionally confusing is that loneliness begins changing its meaning. At first, being alone feels peaceful. Later, it begins feeling empty. There is an important psychological difference between enjoying solitude and experiencing emotional absence. Many avoidants discover this only after enough time has passed for daily routines to become repetitive. The person they once viewed as emotionally demanding gradually becomes the person who understood their habits, shared their experiences, and occupied a unique emotional space in their life. Suddenly, ordinary moments feel different. Achievements feel less satisfying without someone to tell. Holidays feel quieter. Difficult days become heavier because there is no familiar person to lean on, even if they rarely admitted needing that support before. This emotional shift often happens during periods of complete silence. That is one reason no contact can have such a profound psychological effect. Many people misunderstand no contact as a strategy designed to make someone jealous or manipulate them into returning. But its deeper psychological impact comes from removing external emotional pressure. When communication stops completely, the avoidant is no longer reacting to messages, explanations, or emotional requests. Their mind finally has room to process the relationship without feeling cornered. The absence itself becomes emotionally noticeable. Instead of constantly defending their need for distance, they begin experiencing the reality of that distance. Ironically, this is often when curiosity quietly returns. They begin wondering what their former partner is doing, whether they are happy, whether they have moved on, whether someone else has entered their life, whether they still think about the relationship at all. These questions are important because curiosity often appears before longing. The attachment system does not suddenly switch back on overnight. It usually begins with small moments of emotional awareness. A passing thought becomes a recurring thought. A recurring thought becomes emotional reflection. Reflection slowly becomes missing someone. Still, missing someone is not the same as reaching out. This is where many people become confused. They assume that if an avoidant misses them, a message should immediately follow. But internal emotion and external behavior are not always connected. Avoidants often spend long periods wrestling privately with emotions they never express. Pride, uncertainty, fear of rejection, guilt about the breakup, and anxiety about repeating old relationship patterns all create hesitation. Some even convince themselves that reaching out would only reopen old wounds. Others fear discovering that their former partner has already moved on. For someone who struggles with vulnerability, rejection can feel far more threatening than continuing to wonder what might have happened. This creates one of the most invisible stages of the entire process. On the outside, nothing appears to be happening. There are no messages, no calls, no obvious signs of regret, but internally, emotional conflict is slowly growing stronger. The relief that once dominated their thoughts has been replaced by unanswered questions, unfinished emotions, and a growing awareness that the relationship may have meant far more than they allowed themselves to admit. And it is inside that silent psychological battle that the possibility of returning first begins to take shape, not because the avoidant suddenly changes overnight, but because the emotional distance they fought so hard to create no longer feels as comforting as it once did. Why would someone who chose to leave spend weeks or months thinking about coming back without ever sending a single message? Why would they check your social media, wonder how you're doing, replay old conversations in their mind, and still remain completely silent? This is one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant attachment. People often believe that if someone truly misses you, they will naturally reach out. But for an avoidant, the desire for connection and the fear of connection can exist at the exact same time, creating an exhausting internal battle that keeps them frozen between two opposite emotional needs. By this stage, the initial relief has faded. The distractions that once kept uncomfortable feelings buried are no longer as effective. Memories have become more frequent, and emotional curiosity has grown stronger. But instead of bringing clarity, these feelings often create confusion. The avoidant begins asking questions they tried to avoid earlier. Was ending the relationship really the right decision? Was the relationship actually the problem, or was it their fear of intimacy? Could things have been different if they had handled emotions another way? These questions don't always produce immediate answers. Instead, they create cognitive dissonance. This happens when two deeply held beliefs begin fighting each other. On one side, the avoidant still values independence and emotional self-protection. They tell themselves that staying alone is safer, simpler, and less stressful. On the other side, another part of them quietly recognizes the emotional bond they shared with their former partner. The mind struggles to hold both beliefs at once, and that tension becomes emotionally exhausting. Dismissive avoidants often try to solve this conflict by relying on logic. They analyze the relationship instead of fully feeling it. They focus on practical reasons the breakup happened. They remind themselves of disagreements, differences, or unmet expectations. This helps reduce emotional discomfort, at least temporarily. But emotions rarely disappear simply because they have been explained logically. The subconscious continues holding on to experiences that mattered, even when the conscious mind insists everything is over. Fearful avoidants experience an even more intense conflict. Their attachment system constantly shifts between longing and fear. One moment they imagine reconnecting and fixing everything that went wrong. The next moment they picture getting hurt again and immediately retreat emotionally. This emotional push-pull can continue for weeks, months, or even years if deeper attachment wounds remain unresolved. During this stage, many avoidants become quiet observers. They may not contact their ex directly, but their curiosity grows stronger. They wonder if you've changed. They wonder if you're happier without them. They may look at your public social media, ask mutual friends how you're doing, or notice small details that help them feel connected without risking emotional exposure. These actions don't always mean reconciliation is certain, but they often reveal something important. Emotional detachment is slowly being replaced by emotional awareness. This is why silence can sometimes be misleading. The absence of communication does not automatically mean the absence of thought. Some avoidants think about reaching out dozens of times before ever typing a message. They imagine different conversations in their head. They wonder how you might respond. They ask themselves whether enough time has passed. Every possibility carries emotional risk. One of the strongest barriers during this stage is fear of rejection. People often assume avoidants are emotionally fearless because they appear confident after a breakup. In reality, many avoidants are deeply uncomfortable with situations where they cannot control the outcome. Reaching out requires vulnerability. It means accepting the possibility that the other person may ignore them, reject them, or reveal they have moved on. For someone whose attachment style already associates vulnerability with emotional danger, this possibility feels overwhelming. Guilt can also become a powerful emotional force. As emotional distance fades, many avoidants begin recognizing the pain their withdrawal caused. They remember unanswered messages, difficult conversations they avoided, or moments when they emotionally shut down instead of communicating honestly. Admitting these memories means confronting uncomfortable feelings about themselves. Some avoidants would rather remain silent than face the shame of believing they hurt someone they genuinely cared about. This emotional conflict often explains why mixed signals appear. Instead of expressing their feelings directly, they test the emotional waters. A simple text asking how you've been, liking an old photo, watching your stories without saying anything, sending a message that feels casual but strangely timed. These small actions are sometimes called breadcrumbs because they create contact without requiring full emotional commitment. Breadcrumbing does not always mean manipulation. Sometimes it reflects genuine uncertainty. The avoidant wants connection but is still afraid of intimacy. They want reassurance without exposing too much of themselves. They hope the conversation will naturally grow, allowing them to reconnect without openly admitting how much they have been thinking about the relationship. Whether this process leads anywhere depends on something much deeper than missing an ex. Missing someone is a feeling. Returning to a healthy relationship requires emotional growth. If the underlying attachment patterns remain unchanged, the same cycle often repeats itself. The avoidant may return, experience closeness again, become overwhelmed by vulnerability, withdraw once more, and create another painful breakup. Without self-awareness, emotional habits tend to recreate familiar outcomes. This is why personal growth changes everything. An avoidant who has begun recognizing their emotional defenses often approaches relationships differently. They become more willing to communicate discomfort instead of disappearing. They slowly learn that needing someone does not mean losing themselves. They discover that emotional intimacy is not the same as emotional control. These changes rarely happen quickly, but they create the possibility of building a relationship that feels safer for both people. At the same time, growth matters just as much for the former partner. Someone who spends the entire separation waiting, chasing, or putting life on hold often recreates an unhealthy emotional balance. But someone who heals, rebuilds confidence, develops emotional security, and creates a fulfilling life changes the entire dynamic. They no longer seek reassurance from the avoidant. They become emotionally grounded, making future interactions healthier and more balanced. By this point, the avoidant's internal struggle has become impossible to ignore. The emotional walls that once felt protective are beginning to feel isolating. The questions they tried to silence have grown louder. The memories have become more meaningful. The possibility of reaching out feels closer than ever. Yet one final psychological barrier remains, a barrier that determines why some avoidants finally return with genuine intention, while others continue carrying their feelings in silence, never taking the step that could change everything. What finally makes an avoidant ex come back? Is it time? Is it loneliness? Is it realizing they made a mistake? Or is it something much deeper than any single emotion? The truth is that there is no universal timeline. Some avoidants reach out after a few weeks. Others take several months. Some never return at all. The difference is rarely measured by the calendar. It is measured by what has changed inside them while they were away. The final stage begins when emotional avoidance no longer provides the comfort it once did. For a long time, distance felt like protection. It reduced pressure. It created space. It allowed the avoidant to regain a sense of control, but eventually another reality begins to emerge. Independence without meaningful connection can slowly become isolation. This is where many avoidants experience a powerful emotional shift. They begin realizing that what they escaped was not necessarily the relationship itself. In many cases, they were escaping the uncomfortable emotions that intimacy awakened inside them. That realization can be difficult because it challenges a belief they have carried for years. If every relationship ends the same way, eventually the mind starts asking whether the problem has always been the other person, or whether the deeper struggle has been an inability to stay emotionally present when closeness becomes uncomfortable. For some avoidants, this realization creates the motivation to reconnect. They remember not only the love they received, but also the emotional safety that existed before fear began taking over. They recognize moments when their partners showed patience, understanding, or consistency. Instead of focusing only on conflict, they begin appreciating the emotional value of the relationship as a whole. But awareness alone is not enough. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that if an avoidant returns, it automatically means they have changed. Returning and growing are two very different things. An avoidant can miss you deeply and still struggle with vulnerability. They can regret the breakup and still avoid difficult conversations. They can love you and still repeat old emotional habits if those habits remain unexamined. This is why understanding the reason behind their return is far more important than the return itself. Sometimes an avoidant comes back because loneliness has become unbearable. They miss companionship. They miss familiarity. They miss having someone who understood them. These feelings are completely human. But loneliness is temporary. Once emotional closeness begins increasing again, the same fears that existed before may quickly return if nothing has fundamentally changed. A different kind of return happens when emotional growth has taken place. This person does not simply say they missed you. They communicate differently. They take responsibility for their actions instead of avoiding uncomfortable conversations. They become more consistent. They stop disappearing when emotions become difficult. They show a willingness to understand both their own needs and yours. The difference is not found in beautiful words. It is found in repeated behavior. Real emotional growth is usually quiet. It appears through honesty instead of excuses, through consistency instead of unpredictability, through accountability instead of blame, through vulnerability instead of emotional distance. These qualities cannot be faked for long because they require internal change, not temporary effort. This is also why your own healing matters so much during this process. Many people spend months waiting for an avoidant to return, believing that reunion will finally bring peace. But emotional security cannot depend on another person's decision. If your happiness rests entirely on whether someone comes back, you remain emotionally trapped, even while physically separated. Healing changes your position completely. Instead of asking, "How do I make them return?" you begin asking, "If they return, are we capable of creating something healthier than before?" That single shift transforms the entire relationship dynamic. You stop chasing validation. You stop interpreting silence as proof that you were not enough. You stop believing someone else's emotional limitations define your worth. Instead, you begin recognizing that attachment patterns explain behavior, but they do not excuse repeated emotional harm. Healthy relationships require more than chemistry. They require emotional availability, trust, communication, and the willingness to stay present during difficult moments. Love without emotional safety often becomes an exhausting cycle of hope and disappointment. That is why the healthiest reconciliation happens when both people have grown during the time apart. The avoidant learns that vulnerability is not weakness. The other partner learns that love does not require self-abandonment. Both people develop stronger emotional boundaries. Both become more honest about their needs. Both understand that conflict does not automatically mean rejection. Only then does the relationship have a real chance of breaking old attachment cycles instead of repeating them. And sometimes something equally important happens. The avoidant reaches out, but you are no longer the same person who was devastated by the breakup. You have rebuilt your confidence. You have created new routines. You have strengthened your emotional stability. You have discovered that your life can feel meaningful with or without their return. Ironically, this is often the moment when the relationship dynamic changes the most. The fear that once drove you to chase has been replaced by calm. Your decisions are no longer guided by anxiety, but by self-respect. You no longer accept inconsistency simply because you fear losing someone. That emotional security allows you to evaluate their return with clear eyes rather than desperate hope. Some avoidants do come back, some do not. Some return only to repeat the same cycle. Others return because they have genuinely confronted the fears that once controlled them. The timeline is never the real answer. The real answer is growth. Growth determines whether distance becomes permanent separation, temporary reflection, or the foundation for a healthier future. Perhaps the most surprising truth is this: the strongest position you can ever reach is not waiting for someone to realize your value. It is becoming so emotionally secure that their return is no longer something you need. It is simply one possibility among many. And maybe the question that matters most isn't, when will an avoidant ex come back? Maybe the deeper question is, when they do, will both of you be emotionally different enough to create a relationship that no longer needs to end the same way?